The sun beat down harshly on the dry ground as a dusty military truck rolled through the gates of one of the toughest army training camps in the country. Out stepped a woman in her late 30s, plain clothes, soft features, and a quiet, unsure look in her eyes. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't tough-looking. And as soon as the recruits and even some of the officers caught sight of her, the whispers began. "Who is she? What's she doing here? Wrong place, lady." Her name was Aaliyah, and she had arrived at the base to visit someone, but no one cared to ask who. Instead, they laughed at her, mocked her for how she walked, what she wore, how out of place she looked. To them, she was just another civilian woman who didn't belong in a place built for strength, discipline, and grit. One of the cadets even sneered, "You must be lost, ma'am. This isn't a shopping mall." But Aaliyah didn't answer. She quietly sat under the shade of a tree near the training field, her hands folded in her lap, eyes watching the soldiers push themselves to their limits. Some continued to chuckle. Others shook their heads, wondering why she wasn't asked to leave. What they didn't know was that Aaliyah had seen more pain and sacrifice than many of them could imagine. Her calm wasn't weakness. It was the patience of someone who knew exactly why she was there. And just as the laughter around her reached a peak, a deep rumble broke through the sky. Heads turned. A helicopter. The sound grew louder. Dust kicked up in the air. The camp came to a standstill as the aircraft descended right into the base. Soldiers scrambled, officers stood up straight, and the mood shifted instantly. When the doors of the helicopter opened, everyone froze, because the man stepping out wasn't just any officer. He was the general, decorated, respected, feared, and walking directly toward Aaliyah. And in that moment, every single person understood. But what did the general say? And what happened next? Keep watching to find out. The air was thick with silence as the general walked toward Aaliyah. His boots crunched against the gravel, every step firm and full of purpose. No one dared move. Soldiers who had been laughing moments ago now stood stiff, unsure where to look. Some were already whispering, trying to piece together what they were witnessing. Why was the highest-ranking officer in the region landing here unannounced? And why was he heading straight toward the woman they had just mocked? Aaliyah didn't flinch. She stood slowly, her hands brushing down her simple clothes, and looked up at the man approaching. Their eyes met his sharp and commanding, hers calm but knowing. No one knew yet, but this wasn't the first time she had been to a military base. She had stood by him through war fronts, sleepless nights, and unspoken worries. Yet she had never asked for recognition or shown off her place in his life. Around them, soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. The camp was known for its brutal discipline and rigid rules. Outsiders never walked in freely, and certainly not without clearance. And yet, she had arrived without an ID check. No escort, just quietly stepping into a world that wasn't meant to welcome her. Whispers turned into concern. Had they crossed a line? Was this woman his wife? What they didn't know was that Aaliyah had never wanted anyone to know. She had lived in the shadow of a powerful man, not because she was weak, but because she believed in quiet strength. She didn't need titles or uniforms to prove her worth, but that day, something had changed. The general stopped in front of her. The silence was crushing, and then, without a word, he did something no one expected. What happened in the next few seconds would leave the entire camp stunned. The general paused in front of Aaliyah, then slowly reached out and took her hand, not forcefully, but with quiet respect. Gasps rippled through the rows of soldiers. Some lowered their eyes, already sensing the weight of their earlier mistake. Others stood frozen, trying to understand how this soft-spoken woman could be the wife of the most powerful man they'd ever seen in uniform. But the general didn't speak to them. He spoke only to her, in a low voice they couldn't hear. Then he turned, still holding her hand, and walked past the stunned officers toward the command post, without a single order. Given, the guards moved aside. The message was clear. She wasn't just someone's wife. She had rank through respect, not uniform. Behind them, the murmurs began again. Some officers tried to justify their actions, saying they didn't know who she was. Others stayed quiet, guilt burning in their expressions. Among the cadets, a younger soldier named Farouk looked particularly shaken. He had been the loudest of the group, mocking her earlier. Now he stood still, remembering every careless word he'd spoken. Inside the camp office, the general and Aliyah sat alone. What no one outside knew was that this visit wasn't just personal. There was a deeper reason. Aliyah had brought with her a message, not from any command, but from a widow of a fallen soldier, someone the general had once promised to protect. Aliyah had taken it upon herself to carry the words of those who were often forgotten, the families behind the uniforms, the ones who bore the silent battles. At the same time, whispers began to spread through the higher ranks. Why had the general not informed anyone of his visit? Why was his wife acting as a messenger? And was this just the beginning of something bigger? Outside, the camp returned to routine, but nothing felt normal. Something had shifted, and the silence that followed was louder than any order ever given. Farouk couldn't shake the weight in his chest. Every order he followed that day felt heavier, every step slower. His mind kept replaying the scene, how they had laughed at her, how he had been the one to say, "She doesn't belong here." And now she was in the command post with the general, and no one knew what was being said behind that closed door. Word had spread fast through the camp. Some believed the general would come down hard on them. Others whispered that Aliyah's visit had something to do with an internal investigation. But no one really knew. The uncertainty made every soldier restless. Inside the office, the general sat quietly as Aliyah laid out the letter. It was handwritten, edges creased from travel. She didn't cry. She never did. But the sadness in her eyes told stories of soldiers' families who had been left with more questions than answers. There had been an incident in a remote training post, one that had been swept under the rug. A young officer, under immense pressure, had lost his life. The official reports blamed it on mental fatigue, but the letter told a different story, one about bullying, humiliation, and failure of leadership. Aliyah wasn't just here for a visit. She had come to remind him of a promise they both made years ago, to protect not only the lives of soldiers, but also their dignity. She had risked being mocked, ignored, and dismissed, and she had been, but still. She came. Outside, Farouk was called into the senior tent. His name had reached the command post. He didn't know why. Was he being discharged? Was this the end of his career? All across the camp, tension stretched like a drawn bow. No one spoke freely anymore. Each moment passed like a storm cloud, waiting to break. Officers checked their files. Others checked their conscience. And Aliyah, the woman they had once laughed at, had become the silent force behind a reckoning none of them had seen coming. But the true storm hadn't even started yet. Just when the camp was beginning to brace for the fallout of Aliyah's quiet confrontation, something happened that no one could have predicted. A second helicopter appeared on the horizon, this one bearing a different insignia. It wasn't scheduled. It wasn't cleared. And it wasn't from their chain of command. The mood across the camp shifted again. Soldiers stared up, shielding their eyes from the sun. Officers reached for radios. The general stood at the window of the command post, jaw tight, eyes locked on the approaching aircraft. Aliyah remained seated, calm as ever, but her expression changed. She recognized that insignia. It belonged to the Central Military Review Board. Their arrival was rare, and usually meant one thing. An internal investigation was about to begin. The helicopter touched down hard, sending dust flying. 4 senior officers stepped out, their presence sharp, their eyes scanning everything. They didn't wait for permission. They walked straight toward the command building, past confused guards and stunned recruits. For a moment, the camp felt like it was holding its breath. Inside the command room, the lead investigator saluted the general, then placed a sealed file on the table. "We received an anonymous report," he said. "Allegations of misconduct, suppressed complaints, possible cover-ups within training camps under your command." He looked at Aaliyah, then back at the general. "We didn't expect to find your wife here, but perhaps that explains why the report reached us at all." The general didn't respond immediately. Outside, Farouk stood just out of sight, listening, piecing things together. Aaliyah wasn't just delivering a letter. She had lit a fire under a system that had ignored too many voices for too long. Now, the stakes were far bigger than wounded pride or embarrassed soldiers. If the accusations held weight, careers could be destroyed, reputations ruined, and the very command of the general could fall under question. The soldiers who once laughed at a simple woman now looked toward the command post, wondering how far the truth would reach and if it was already too late to stop what was coming. The room was silent as the investigators opened the sealed file. Aaliyah watched quietly, her hands resting in her lap, while the general stood behind her, unreadable.